Well, it's 3 o'clock. Welcome to all of you who have joined. We've got a good turnout today. My name is Jack McGinnis, and I'm managing partner at Relationship Impact, a consulting firm with an exclusive focus on working with the executive teams of growing companies and help their CEOs build great leadership teams. So today's webinar, episode 14 in our Great Leadership Teams webinar series, is focused on the CEO's role in building a great leadership team. This is obviously a pivotal discussion because the CEO, as we'll find out during the course of the webinar, is it's critical in terms of shaping the effectiveness of a great leadership team. So just a couple words on logistics. As you know, those of you who have participated in the past, don't feel free to raise your hand. Use the chat feature during the course of the discussion if you have questions, you want to stop me. Secondly, as you'll see in the slide deck, there's a lot of content in here. The slides are kind of thick, so I apologize for any of those of you who kind of are distracted by the amount of content. But I kind of do that on purpose so that when I distribute these out afterwards or post them out afterwards, you have a good amount of content to draw from. So with that in mind, I'd love to get started. So again, the CEO's role in building a great leadership team. So from our perspective, the challenge of building a great leadership team starts with just the fact that you can't just assume that a leadership team is going to come together and you're going to build a great one that's highly functioning by accident. And from our perspective, and you could say that we're kind of biased because it's the work that we do, right? But it's our experience suggests that it requires some nurturing to build a great leadership team, and particularly on the part of the CEO to kind of establish the conditions for the team to be able to thrive. And as I'm sure many of you have seen, in some case, in some way, shape, or form, that leadership teams sometimes can actually become impediments to progress in organizations. They, what we call, they sort of get in their own way. Sometimes, by default, unintentionally, and other times they're just, there's some tough people on the team. Let's just put it like that. So this is all about how this webinar is all about how we can CEOs can set up their teams for success. A couple stats that I'm writing an article that's along with this, and I'm about to submit it to Chief Executive Magazine this week. And so I found some interesting stats on this challenge, right? And so there have been some recent studies by Team Coaching International, McKinsey, and the Center for Creative Leadership, among others, I'm sure, but that have surveyed executives and found that greater than 75% in each of these surveys of executive surveys said their executive teams are ineffective. The same types of surveys, I think, have indicated that those same surveys, same executives surveyed, have indicated that 95% of them believe that if their teams were even a little bit more effective, it would have a dramatic impact on the organization's performance. So that sort of gives you a backdrop on why we believe that it is a challenge to build a great leadership team, and it doesn't happen by accident. And we believe that there's a few faulty assumptions that provide the construct for why many executive teams are not as effective as they could be. And the first is that CEOs assume that just by bringing a group of good, talented leaders together, that it's going to be sufficient to build a great leadership team. in our experience, that is the case. You know, you bring your direct reports together, your functional, your department leaders together, and you assume that they're going to be able to work together well. And there's a few things that get in the way of that, right? And so senior executives often struggle to balance the need to run their functional roles, their departmental roles, with their roles as enterprise leaders. It's also, you know, prior experience on teams is not necessarily a determinant of how well a group of executives is going to work together. You know, the external demands are often greater for the executive team. The move, like we said, from functional to enterprise role and balancing those two is challenging. And sometimes, you know, the visibility is heightened of being on a leadership team, both internally and externally. And those challenges are often not insignificant. So, you know, that assumption of just bringing together a group of talented leaders and they're going to work well together as an executive team is what we've seen is sometimes a faulty assumption. Number two, team members assume that their previous experience and their current skill base are going to be sufficient for them being great leadership team members. And that is sometimes the case. You know, we see that, you know, team members are, you know, have a collaborative mindset to them. And that's a great thing. But also, as we talked about, as I just mentioned earlier, the demands of being on an executive team sometimes create different expectations and different pressures on team members that they're not used to experiencing. And that gets in their way. You know, just to give you an example of, you know, I moved from, you know, being on the executive team now, and not only do I have to play this functional role or this line of business role, but I also have an enterprise role, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the discussion. And that the balance of those two things and how I get incented and what's most important can be sometimes a stressful construct. So again, assuming that your previous experience and skill base are going to be sufficient to work on a executive team is sometimes a faulty assumption. And the third point here on this risky assumption slide is from our experience and what we see, and also some research suggested as well, most senior teams are structured by default as vehicles for sharing information and reporting out on functional progress and hearing decisions made by the CEO or the COO, right? And so that construct, we're not claiming or suggesting that that's a wrong construct, but if you're trying to build a leadership team that has a focus of running the organization beyond just the CEO, then that construct of how a leadership team is set up to share information, report on functional progress is potentially the wrong construct. So those are some assumptions. So these are some common frustrations. And if any of you guys have seen any of our previous webinars, you know, I think we've used these in the past as well. But some common frustrations. These are kind of out of the mouth of some of the CEOs we work with. You know, each team member is extremely talented, but they don't seem to be on the same page without me inserting myself. So, you know, and most times we see that the CEO is saying, well, how come they're not working together? And sometimes the CEO's the reason the CEO gets in the way, which we'll talk again a little bit about as we go through the discussion today. Our leadership team meetings are stale. We've poured out functionally. We don't challenge each other or push for innovation or to continually get better. And again, those assumptions on the previous page, I think, contribute to this type of frustration. While we all seem to like each other, it's very rare that the team or subsets of the team get together to address important enterprise wide issues without me in the room. And again, the faulty assumptions that we had talked about in the previous page sometimes lead to these types of frustrations, for sure. The good news is that building a strong, effective, what we call a great leadership team that is resilient, that learns from each other, is laser focused on results, on the business results the organization is looking for, can have some serious benefit to an organization. I'll give you a couple other stats that you get the benefit of my research that I did from writing this article. A couple important stats. One, research by global consulting firm McKinsey suggests that executives are 5 times more productive when working as part of a high-performing leadership team than they are when working as part of an average one. The research also indicates that aligned leadership teams have a 1.9 times increased likelihood of having above median financial performance. So there is some data that suggests that highly functioning executive teams can have a significant impact on organizations. We rely on some anecdotal evidence in the work that we do. I did come across a really cool study by McKinsey a few years back. It's like in 2011-12 timeframe that really did a really thorough analysis of financial performance and how executive teams rated themselves and how they were rated by their organizations. That had strong correlation between financial performance and team performance. So that was, more Fortune 100 type companies. So the good news is that, taking the time, putting some focus on building a great leadership team can have some significant payoff. And we see that both indirectly and directly in the work we do every day. So what does it take for a CEO to make, really do the hard work necessary to build a great team? Well, we believe there's a bit of a mindset shift. If you go back to just the third assumption, the construct may be incorrect. And the natural construct that we see most CEOs falling back on is, that really looking at the executive team as a staff group versus a leadership team. So what we're suggesting is to really, build a great leadership team, you have to think through what is it that you want the team to be like. What type of team are you looking for? Do you really, do you rely on yourself as the CEO, as the conduit for all, focus on all strategic initiatives and all decisions, or are you relying on the executive team, leadership team to to leverage that team so that you are not, the one that has to do all the heavy lifting. Our experience suggests that this is not an easy shift for a lot of CEOs. And I'll give you a couple of examples, and this is kind of bold statement, so forgive me for being this bold, but many CEOs feel like they have to have all the answers, right? And today, in today's world, that's almost impossible. So moving from a situation where you have all the answers to tapping into the collective wisdom of the team, that is sometimes a tough shift for CEOs. They feel like they have to be involved in everything, particularly young growing companies where they were in fact involved in everything. And now they're moving to a place where they have to delegate and rely on others. From lead problem solver to facilitator, right? And I'm not suggesting they shouldn't be involved in problem solving, but not all problem solving. From refereeing and minimizing conflict to fostering what we call productive dialogue, basically just being the ability for folks to challenge, debate, and have, important conversations productively about the most important stuff that the organization's facing. And finally, you know, our argument is that, you know, the shift has to really be about moving from managing a senior staff group to leading a leadership team. And so that's the mindset we're talking about. So what are the three, you know, what are the things, the CEO's role in building and maintaining a great leadership team? We've kind of narrowed them down into three important but related buckets, right? These are not necessarily distinct buckets of stuff, but they're, in order to talk about them, we've separated them into three buckets. The first is moving from staff to a leadership team, which we'll talk about in a couple seconds here. Modeling a few important behaviors to demonstrate that, you know, I am going to do the work that needs to be done myself to build a great team. So that you're demonstrating to those on the team that things are going to be a little bit maybe different, maybe evolved a bit. And then finally, as if any of you have seen any of our other, listened to any of our other webinars, you've heard us talk a good deal about shaping a leadership team purpose. And admittedly, I have had a difficult time conveying this concept over the last year or so. I think I'm getting better at it. I've engaged the help of my partner, Gil, and we've debated this up and down, but I think we've gotten better at it, and it really is an important element for a CEO to build a great team. They have to have something to work on together, right? And so let's talk about each one of these. From moving from staff to a leadership team, what does that really mean? I guess the big thing here is moving from a group of individual functional department lines of business leaders to a team that's working on things together. That's really important things, not just things, but important issues, strategic imperatives together. That's the overall concept. So moving from individuals with a focus solely on their functional department roles to individuals having to balance their enterprise and their functional roles. Moving from where meetings are progress reporting and information sharing to meetings are forward-looking and focus mostly on what the team needs to work on together. Not forgetting the fact that there are functional roles that people have to play and lead. But what we're talking about here is what is it that this team needs to work on together to gain the collective wisdom of the talented folks on the team. Problems are resolved by individual functional leads in conjunction with the CEO. Priorities and problems are addressed by the team. Not all priorities and problems, but those that the teams decides to work on together. And goals and priorities are established by individual functional leads, and moving to goals and priorities are established by the team. Again, not all goals and priorities, but the goals and priorities that are most important for the leadership team to drive the strategic imperatives that it chooses to work on together. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. This came to life to me a couple of weeks ago. I'm working with a pharmaceutical leadership team of a pharmaceutical company, and I won't bore you with all the details, but there's one woman that I met with who is the head of a therapeutic area group, and has to rely on some of her leadership team colleagues to do the work that she does, and it became very clear to me that she's not getting the support she needs from her executive team colleagues, not because they don't want to help her and not because they're not nice people, but because they have developed their own set of priorities, and her priorities are not theirs. So, and and they haven't even discussed what the team's main priority should be. So by default, each functional leader will, establish a set of priorities and deploy resources accordingly. So our bias and our point of view is that had this team, and we're moving towards that, had this team, and when this team gets together and gains agreement on what its purpose is collectively and what it's going to focus on together, that therapeutic area lead may or may not get support from her colleagues, but at least they'll have had a discussion about why, if that makes sense. So this is our concept about moving from senior staff focus to a leadership team focus, and we really believe that the benefit of this is that it really leverages the experience, the talent, the wisdom of the senior staff, and that experience, talent, and wisdom can be squandered, and opportunities for greater innovation can be lost with a senior staff model if there's not a collective focus. We also believe that when an organization's senior leaders collaborate on important priorities and hold each other accountable for collective individual actions, there can be a tremendous downstream impact in the organization. Another study that I'll quote, and that's quoted for years now, is an Aon Global Best Practice or Best Employer Research Report. Basically suggests, I won't read the jargon here, but basically suggests that managers and staff are watching how the leadership interacts with each other. And from my perspective, not so much, they're not watching to see if they go out to beers together or to go to baseball games together. How do they interact with each other, and how are they holding each other accountable to the most important things that the organization should be focused on? And so basically what that says is a great team, and from our perspective, can have a dramatic impact downstream on an organization because everyone's watching how they interact, particularly again in small growing organizations. So this is our concept around moving from staff to team. Okay, modeling a few behaviors. Okay, it's more than a few. And basically these behaviors fall into, I don't have a slide that talks about this, but falls into 3 buckets, right? Self-awareness, productive dialogue, and accountability, right? And so self-awareness is critical, right? Really important. CEO wants to build a great leadership team. He or she has to understand what they're doing that's helping to construct a great leadership team, and what they're doing that's potentially getting in the way of creating a great leadership team. And a couple of those things are you open to other people's perspectives? Truly, do you say it or do you really mean it? And when people have diverging points of view, or maybe outlandish points of view, do you dismiss them either by your body language or outright, or do you have a sense of curiosity to you? God, what's that all about? I mean, that came from left field. Wonder where they're coming from with that. Are you receptive to feedback? From, again, I'm thinking about being self-aware. Am I receptive to feedback? Do I say I want feedback, and then when I get it, I dismiss it? Or am I actually open and listen to it? Really, really important. So self-awareness is really important, and it's really, there's 2 parts of self-awareness. It's how you see yourself, and then, you got to ask people, how do they see you? And do those 2 things jive with each other? And particularly those things like understanding other people's perspectives, or at least listening to them, being receptive to feedback, giving feedback well, setting clear expectations, those types of behaviors that are really important. Do you do that well? Because those are really important in building a great team. or are you challenged by that? And if you are challenged by that as a CEO, it will be very difficult to build a great team. It just will. Can you build a great team? You can, but it means that the folks that work for you on that team will have to work around you, in my opinion, in our opinion. So that's the self-awareness part of this. The second part is productive dialogue. And you know, we believe that productive dialogue is perhaps the thing that holds leadership teams back most. And what we mean by productive dialogue is very simple. Is the environment at the executive team, or leadership team, one where members can challenge, debate, confront each other on the most important priorities, most important things that are driving the organization in a way that moves the issues forward and leaves minimal relational damage or scars or whatever. And promoting that requires all the things like we talked about under self-awareness, but it also requires an ability for the CEO to get out of the way sometimes and not be the one that's managing all the conflicts or problem solving for two executives that are at each other's throats. I'm not suggesting they can't help, but when your first reaction is, I'm going to get in and resolve that problem because these two guys aren't getting along with each other, you're exacerbating and extending a potential serious problem. So your job is to, back off, say, hey, you guys figure this out. If you need my help, I'll help you figure it out. So creating productive dialogue and promoting open challenge and debate, when folks see you doing that as a CEO, they will be more likely to step in, maybe not the first time, but step in and do some of that as well. And the third bucket I would characterize as, the few key behaviors is accountability. Modeling accountability is huge, right? And so that can be the soft stuff accountability. So I commit that I'm going to be receptive to feedback. I'm going to listen to other people's perspectives. I'm going to not walk over people during meetings, that type of thing. And when I don't, I want to hear, tell me when I'm not doing it, right? And that's one type of accountability. The other one is that, I committed to doing X, Y, or Z. That's really important to helping you as your function, in your functional role, move an issue forward, for example, and I never show up to do it, or I'm late, or or whatever, I get in the way, or I take over, those types of things. And so when you demonstrate that you are accountable to the individuals on the team, and it's not just them being accountable to you, then the tables turn a bit. And so these behaviors are critical. And again, we've kind of grouped them into self-awareness from the CEO's perspective, creating an environment where productive dialogue can thrive, and demonstrating that you are holding yourself accountable as well as holding the team accountable. And so those behaviors are huge. And critical. I hope you're getting the connection between the modeling of the behaviors and the shift from what we're calling managing a staff group to leading a team. Next, shaping team purpose. Okay, and this will be a summary for some of you. I've noticed some of you have participated in a couple of our webinars, so this will be a summary for some of you. But it really important. There's no question that a team can help create the leadership team purpose, but it really is the CEO's job to make that purpose, to facilitate the development of that purpose, and to hold yourself and the team accountable for executing on it. So leadership team purpose is simply making sure that the team is, focused on those issues that require the team's collective cross-boundary expertise, such as strategic imperatives, or cross-organizational resource allocation, or how to capture synergies across business units, right? Those important strategic imperatives that only the 8-10 people on the executive team can really focus on and drive. It should steer clear of anything that can be handled by individual departments, right? And that's really shouldn't be the focus of the executive team. You hire good people, you let them lead their units, and you make sure there's a process for monitoring and checking in that they're doing that. What we're talking about here is what are the things, the most important things, priorities that the executive team needs to focus on to drive the organization's most important priorities. And from our perspective, purpose establishes a foundation for how a team will operate and behave as a unit. It creates clarity of focus, crystallizes priorities, and enhances efficiencies. Without it, it's really hard for members of the team to understand what their enterprise role is. And again, it falls back to maybe there is no enterprise role. Maybe it's just maybe we're just a group of staff people, which can work. I'm not suggesting it can't work, but if you're trying to create a great leadership team, the staff model is insufficient from our perspective. So elements of the team's purpose has to be consequential, right? It has to be something that's meaningful, important, that drives the organization's strategy and mission, right? Has to be challenging. If it's just some simple task that can be, obviously can probably be delegated. Potentially most important, has to be really clear to all. It's clear what it is we're working on and what the outcome will be when we're finished working on it. And evolving is perhaps, so those three, consequential, challenging, and clear, come from the book called Senior Leadership Teams by Ruth Wegeman. And we've added a fourth one, which is called Evolving. And what we mean by that is that leadership team purpose is not stagnant. It doesn't, it's at least 12 to 18 months likely, but it really changes based on the environment that you're working in, the competitive environment, the organizational construct, the financial environment, all of those factors. And so it should be an evolving construct as well. And so what are some simple steps for creating purpose? There's three here. I'm going to add a fourth as I was writing this article, I decided that there's really a fourth step here as well. First is working as a team to identify the most critical strategic imperatives. And obviously if you had a strategic plan, you start with that. And what are the most critical strategic imperatives that are facing the organization right now? And what are the ones that require integration among at least a quorum or most of the executive team members? Identify the interdependencies among those functional areas. Really important. And again, this is one of those things where the process you go through is almost as important as the outcome. Having the discussions about how we integrate and how are we interdependent is really important. And then narrowing those interdependencies down to a critical few is, basically prioritizing. And finally, the fourth step that I'll argue is that the CEO really gets to decide. Once that work is done, then it's up to you to say, yeah, I've taken this, I've massaged it, or I agree 100% with everyone, but this is now our purpose as a leadership team, and this is what we're going to focus on for the next 12 to 18 months. And the stuff on the right side of this slide is important as well. It gives you some examples of not necessarily what a purpose statement looks like, because again, we're not so much focused on the wordsmithing of a purpose statement, but what is the example? What are some example contexts for creating a purpose? And here's a few from, from our client base. A young professional services firm that grew beyond a highly, that's growing beyond a highly concentrated customer mix. Basically, they're 75% of their revenues one client, right? And that obviously is a challenge. So mobile, that is obvious, is to the executive team had to mobilize around that challenge, basically come up with one go-to-market strategy. 10-year-old construction contractors scaling very fast and running into service and productivity issues. They've stepped back. They've are still growing very fast, but now there's some organization to how they're growing. They have an three-person operations team as a subset of their executive team that meets weekly to make sure materials management and project management and the installation crews are well organized and they're dealing with the issues that any construction contractor has to deal with. Service challenges, lost materials in the warehouse, not getting the right stuff out to the sites, all that kind of stuff. And so there's a laser focus on that. Start a medical device company with a recent FDA approval and a large injection of growth capital. So how do we get ourselves, how do we get the company to really focus on, we just got approval for this product, we just got a lot of capital, how do we not waste the capital? And how do we get this product to market as quick as we can, right? And so those are some examples of what a compelling challenge might be. So I would ask you to ask yourselves, what is your most compelling challenge? And are you approaching this challenge as a staff or as a team, right? It's an annoying question, but it's a critical, important one. When you ask yourself the question and you understand what we're talking about in terms of managing a senior team versus managing a leadership team, I think you'll get the concept. And finally, the CEO's role. We believe this in all our hearts, that leadership teams are critical to the efficiency and health, a long-term efficiency and health of an organization. And the best teams evolve to ones where individuals feel accountable to the team. The leader serves as a coach rather than a primary source of accountability, and the team becomes competent at holding itself accountable. And that is hard to get to. So that's what the CEO's role. Our aspiration is that's where the role goes to, but there's a lot of heavy lifting to step back and get a team to really be high performing, as effective as they possibly can be. And from our perspective, the role requires three things. First, making the decision to move from managing a staff group to a leadership team, modeling a few important behaviors, and then creating a compelling, organizing leadership team purpose that helps the leadership team figure out what's most important for it to work on to drive the organization's most important priorities. So that's the webinar today. I hope you have enjoyed it. You'll be the first to get a link to the draft article that we're submitting this week to Chief Executive Magazine that will summarize in probably a little bit greater detail the presentation we gave today. But if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or send me an email. Oops. And with that, that is the end of today's webinar. I appreciate your participation. I will send out a link to a page on our website that has the slides from today, a transcript from today, a link to our article. And again, I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. I hope you participate on our next one, which will be in the third week of April. I haven't come up with the topic yet, but we'll be doing that in the next few days. And again, appreciate your participation. And I look forward to seeing you on our next edition of Great Leaders Build Great Leadership Teams webinar series. Take care.